Hello. Hello, Father Noel. I want to take just a moment to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my story with you. My spiritual journey is the most important part of my life. My name is Mary Meg Dissinger, and I live in deep South Texas, and I have had the most wonderful spiritual life. I can't even imagine being anyone else but me. When it all began, when I was about 3 years old, when we had moved to a different town in Kentucky on the Ohio River, a beautiful, beautiful town. And my brother, who was 10 years older than so that made him about 13, had been serving the Mass. I was raised Roman Catholic, and my mother was Roman Catholic, and my father was Episcopalian. Um, we moved from Pennsylvania, where my parents had been raised and lived with loving families for generations. We were part of the great diaspora of the 1950s, that following World War II. We moved to a place where we knew no one, and prior to our moving, my mother had lost everyone in her family within 5 years and became um, so when we moved, she was really depressed. When my brother started, and my brother and my sister were in Catholic school with with Ursuline nuns, and my brother started to serve at a mansion on the next street up on a hill. He started to serve the Mass. The mansion had been donated to a group of nuns who were cloistered and provided the sacrament. That was part of their thing. They provided the sacrament. But this chapel that these very wealthy people in Kentucky had built in their home was, as I believe it to be true, the chapel was a replication, the altar was a replication of the altar at Notre Dame, but in miniature. And it was a small room. There were pews, there were probably 5 pews and a communion rail, and then this beautiful altar in white and gold. And then off to the left, there was a curtain, and you would walk into this chapel, and the mass would begin, and with these incredible voices singing in Latin, because the nuns were behind the curtain and they were singing the mass in Latin. And my brother, whom I adored, was up with the priest. And at 3, I was just enamored of this. Now, to get there every day, we had to walk through what I see as a forest, but actually, it was just a lot that had some trees on it. And very often it was cold, and my mother would carry me. And then we would walk into this magical place. And, and at one point, I remember saying to her, I love to go here. It's so special. There's something here that makes me feel so good. And she said to me, "It's the Holy Spirit." And that went on until I went to school, going there on a daily basis. Um, for about a year, I think that happened. And then my brother was having problems with the Catholic high school. He came from a completely different form of Roman Catholicism than was being practiced. The bishop of this area was converted from being a Southern Baptist, and there were a lot of rules that my family wasn't used to. And when my brother rebelled and went to the public high school, my mother was denied the sacraments. My mother was denied the sacraments several times during this foray because she didn't stop practicing her form of Catholicism. Now, in the meanwhile, she also, this is of course when the nuns did not drive, she drove the nuns everywhere. I mean, the rest of us were still in Catholic school, and she loved the nuns, and we all loved the nuns, and we got to drive to this beautiful monastery in Kentucky, where it was one of the most beautiful, it's still one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. And so I had a wonderful relationship with every one of my teachers because they loved my mother, and she brought snacks when we drove. My mother plays an important part of my spirituality. Very early on, I began to exhibit a gift, which I wasn't sure was a gift at the time, but I was able to, or I predicted people's deaths. And it wasn't a prediction, it was just, for example, they said Uncle John was coming to visit. And he was a friend of the family, but we called him Uncle John. And I looked at my mother and I said, he's not coming. And lo and behold, that night, John was in a horrible accident and he died. And then there were several other incidents like this. And at a certain point, my mother told me, this is a gift. My mother was Irish, pure Irish. Her father was Irish, her mother was Irish. And she said, Meg, you have the sight. It's common in our family, and we just don't talk about it with other people, but it's a gift from God. And also, I was in my young life, before I went to school, I had a dear friend, and we talked to the fairies, and I was always encouraged. I was the third child, and my mother was tired of reading nursery stories. So she read from me from the Lake Poets. She read to me from the Lake Poets. She read John Donne to me. She was a fan of W.B. Yeats, and she read The Second Coming. And those things made a huge impact. I read very early because I had older brothers and sisters, and I became very involved with Greek and Roman mythology. And I loved the stories that I heard in school. In the first 2 years of school, I had wonderful, wonderful teachers. The third year in school, we moved to a different place, and I had a lot of problems there. I had trouble adjusting into this new parish. It was a brand new parish. I would do things like when the priest came in to talk, I would ask questions like questions I'd asked before, like, how come a priest can take away my sins? Isn't Jesus supposed to do that? And of course, that was when we donated 10 cents every week to the pagan babies so the pagan babies could meet Jesus. And I questioned why can't they meet Jesus? And they said, well, because they go to limbo if they never are baptized. And that didn't make sense to me. I had an idea of God, Spirit, the Trinity that was beautiful and was loving and kind. And I was hearing about this horrible God who sent babies to a place where they would never know God. I honestly liked the gods of the Greek and Romans better. At least I knew they were honest about, the fact that they had a duality. The priest would come to question us. And pretty soon I was removed from the classroom. But I was sent down to the younger grades to help. So I didn't even think about why I was being removed when the priest came. And it was because I was asking hard questions that didn't want to be answered. So my spiritual journey had two phases at this point. And fast forward, in my life, I continued to read, I continued to research, I continued to search for a God that was more understanding because this angry, vengeful God did not work for me. And I found succor, which was a word I used or I learned when they talked about the Virgin Mary. And by the way, during this time, my mother had shifted all of her devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and I could find peace there. The other thing that I did was every day from the time I could remember, we recited a prayer at night to our guardian angels and in the morning to our guardian angels. And I saw mine. I had a close relationship to my guardian angels and to dead grandparents because I didn't have any grandparents. I had one grandmother but I never saw her because she was living in, or rarely saw her. And and she was a Protestant and pretty much thought Catholics had tails, my understanding. So it was challenging. It was, there were a lot of challenges growing up. We had then by then had moved to another place where where people were a whole lot more open. And by the way, I started singing in the choir at this new church in this new parish because I had a voice. I can sing and I love to sing. And they went through and they just took kids that could sing. So I started singing in Latin and I started singing the mass, and all of a sudden I found my spirituality again. Every time I sang the mass, every time I had to get up to go to early masses to sing, every time I had to sing a funeral, all of that brought me great peace and great joy. And and that's where I found my spirituality again. When I was in high school, we had then moved to another place, and I was still singing in the choir. And at that time, we were still singing in Latin, and but it was a very small, beautiful church, reminiscent of that first church, that first chapel, and with a wonderful priest. And I got very involved in CYO, and we would have long talks driving. I was older, and so I sat in the front seat. And when I began to question and to search and to realize that, I was not happy with this God that I was being presented with, Father Lepardo gave me a copy of a book by Teilhard de Chardin and told me to go and find my voice, which I did, you know. And he said, I hope you come back, but by then, you know, the church was changing and I was changing. I did find my voice. I had a high school teacher that was probably, I don't know what she was. She was intra-spiritual, and she found out about me and she helped me. She gave me books to read like The Prophet and introduced me to different religions. And she was a wonderful history teacher. So my spirituality came from all that. It took me about 5 or 6 years to find my place, but I did find my place. I did find my place in a philosophy that suits me and suits my life. And so I'm very grateful. And that's my story.